How much did a loaf of bread cost in ancient Rome? Picture a Roman citizen, up early in the morning, sometime during the reign of Augustus, walking through one of Rome's crowded streets, a few bronze coins in hand. He steps into a bakery along the road, fresh loaves sitting on the counter, hands over a couple of coins, and takes home a loaf. This scene seems so ordinary it barely feels worth mentioning. But this simple transaction actually reflects just how complex an economic system an entire empire was built on. Because understanding the price of a loaf of bread means understanding how Rome fed itself, how its currency worked, and why the empire managed to survive for as long as it did. First, we need to know this. Not everyone in Rome got bread the same way. How a city-dwelling citizen accessed bread was completely different from how a farmer in the countryside did. And that difference is where the story gets really interesting. At its peak, the population of the city of Rome approached 1 million. For that era, that's an almost unbelievable number. Feeding a population that large was both a massive logistical necessity for the state and a powerful political tool. This is where we arrive at a system called the Annona. The Annona was a massive state-run system for organizing grain supply. Wheat collected from fertile agricultural regions like Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily was shipped to Rome, stored in enormous warehouses, and distributed to the city's population. And here's the most striking part. For a significant portion of Roman citizens, grain was completely free. Yes, you heard that right. From a certain point onward, a large share of adult male citizens living in Rome had the right to regularly receive free grain from the state. This practice was formalized under what was called the Cura Annoni, and at certain periods, it benefited as many as roughly 200,000 people. So why would a state do this? Part of the answer was political calculation. A large, hungry, and angry city population was a serious threat to any emperor. Roman political history was full of riots and uprisings, and many of these eruptions coincided with periods when bread prices rose or grain supply was disrupted. So free grain distribution was, in a sense, a way of buying social peace. Writers of the time described this sardonically as bread and circuses, two ways to keep the public calm, fill their stomachs, and entertain them. But this free grain wasn't handed out as finished bread. The state distributed raw, unprocessed wheat, and turning that wheat into bread still came with a cost. This is where the real bread economy comes into play. Rome had hundreds of private bakeries, which both processed the grain distributed by the state into bread and produced and sold their own bread independently. Baking, at the time, was a highly respected and regulated profession. Rome even had a dedicated guild system for bakers, and some successful bakers became quite wealthy. Excavations at Pompeii gave us incredibly concrete evidence on this front. Inside a bakery frozen in place beneath volcanic ash, actual loaves of bread were found, genuinely baked, carbonized, but still recognizable loaves. Some of these loaves even bore the baker's own stamp, not unlike how some shops today brand their own products. So what did an actual loaf of bread cost? The records we have vary by period, but we can get a general sense. Using Rome's currency units, the as and the sesterces, an ordinary working-class loaf typically sold for around one or a few as, a fairly modest fraction of a day laborer's wage. But there's an important distinction here. Not all bread was equal. Rome, much like today, had bread of varying quality. The coarsest, cheapest bread was made from whole grain and was generally consumed by the poorest segment of society. Bread made from finely milled white flour was significantly more expensive and appeared on the tables of the wealthy. Some luxury breads were enriched with ingredients like milk, eggs, or even honey, and this kind of bread sold at prices far beyond an ordinary worker's budget. So bread, in a way, was a small but very clear reflection of class divisions within Roman society. Which type of bread you ate, which flour your loaf was made from, was a quiet signal of your social status. Now let's look at how these prices changed over time, because this is where things get even more interesting. In Rome's early periods, the economy was relatively stable. But as the empire grew, as its borders expanded, and especially by the 3rd century, a serious economic crisis began to take hold. Emperors, struggling to cover constantly rising military expenses, began reducing the amount of precious metal in silver coins. In other words, they literally debased the currency. The result, as you might expect, was rapidly rising prices. A loaf of bread that once cost a few, as became far more expensive within a few decades. Some records from this period describe people having to carry sacks full of coins just for everyday purchases, a scene not unlike the hyperinflation that would later occur in 20th century Germany. Emperor Diocletian took a dramatic step to try to halt this crisis. In the year 301, he issued an edict setting official price ceilings across the empire for thousands of goods and services. This edict listed maximum prices item by item, bread included, for hundreds of goods. The goal was to stop speculation and protect public access to basic necessities. But the policy didn't work as intended. When producers and merchants found that selling at the fixed prices hurt their own interests, they began withdrawing goods from the market. Shortages increased, black markets spread, and eventually the edict was largely abandoned. This is considered one of history's earliest major examples of a government trying to halt inflation through price controls, and of market dynamics largely defeating that intervention. So what does all of this tell us? The price of a loaf of bread is, in a way, a small indicator of an entire empire's pulse. During Rome's strongest periods, that price was stable, and the state treated meeting its citizens' most basic need as a political priority. But as the empire came under strain, as spending grew, and as its currency lost value, even this simple daily transaction became increasingly difficult and uncertain. So the next time you look at the price of an ordinary loaf of bread, maybe you'll remember this. Sometimes the biggest economic truths are hidden inside the smallest, most ordinary things. On a bakery counter, in exchange for a few bronze coins.